Okay, we are good. And here we go. What is the state of American health?
Bad and getting worse. I mean, that's about as simple as I can put it. And it seems like the more money we spend, the worse it gets, which tells us that the problem is not resources. The problem is misallocation of resources.
What are your thoughts on the first year of COVID-19 from February 2020 to February 2021? In other words, what happened, why it happened, and what's next?
Oh, from my book, COVID Operation, which I have right here. Um, what happened was a very planned, well planned, I might add, illusion that we were having a pandemic. There was no pandemic. There wasn't in February of last year. There isn't now. All of this was orchestrated for reasons that we can talk about if you like, but this was not anything to do with health. It was everything to do with government control and political reasons and that sort of thing. The fact that it turned into that so many people believed it, including health professionals, really goes to your first question, which is, what is the state of American health? It's terrible. And it's terrible because we have health professionals who aren't very well educated to understand the medical literature, let alone understand what's going on here, and people who are easily persuaded with health information that's patently false. And it's been going on for a long time. This is just the biggest episode of it. In other words, for 25 years that I've been in business, I've been talking about medical tyranny and informed consent, okay? Informed decision making, where people look at risks and benefits and analyze information and make objective, not subjective decisions about their health. This is not the way healthcare is practiced. But if it were, this could never have happened because everybody would have known right away what was going on.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? Keto diets are based on the proposition that for those predisposed to become obese and or diabetic, carbohydrate-rich foods trigger that predisposition. That isn't because of the calories they contain, as the conventional thinking on obesity assumes, but because of the effect these foods have on insulin, the hormone that dominates the regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism. Insulin is secreted mostly in response to carbohydrates, not just in the form of sugars, starches, and grains, whole or otherwise, but also fruits and legumes, which are the staples of a well-formulated plant-based diet. A high insulin level signals fat synthesis and storage, and a low level, its release as free fatty acid back into the circulation, observed the Harvard University metabolism and diabetes researcher George F. Cahill Jr. in 1971 in the prestigious Banting Memorial Lecture at the annual meeting of the American Diabetes Association. This process is like a switch. When fat cells sense the presence of insulin in the circulation, as Cahill described, they respond by storing fat and inhibiting its release, and we get fatter. When insulin is undetectable, we burn stored fat for fuel, and we get leaner. The metabolic state of ketosis, from which the keto diet gets its name, happens when carbohydrates are restricted almost entirely and fat provides most of the fuel for the body. The hormonal insulin-centric regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism remains textbook medicine, yet its relevance to obesity has been effectively ignored by nutritionists and obesity researchers who have overwhelmingly preferred to think that all calories are equally capable of stimulating fat accumulation, that we get fat because we overeat, not because the carbohydrates we consume have some unique ability to stimulate fat accumulation. For some significant proportion of Americans, however, remaining relatively lean and healthy may require minimizing their insulin secretion. This, in turn, means more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrate-rich foods. Animal-sourced foods, meat, fish, fowl, and even processed meat, typically make up the bulk of this approach to weight control because they are almost entirely protein and fat, with minimal carbohydrates. Until insulin was discovered in 1921 and insulin therapy was put to use in treating diabetes, these diets were known as animal diets. They were the standard of care for diabetes, delaying death in what today is called type 1 diabetes, the insulin-dependent form, and controlling the disease indefinitely in those with type 2, the common form associated with excess weight and age. This is still the case. So again, what are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes?
Oh my gosh, where do we begin? I guess the place that I would start is that the ketogenic diet does have some application for, and this would be a long discussion, for treating cancer patients who have very short life expectancy. And it's been used for decades for toddlers who have epilepsy, certain types of epilepsy. And the purpose with toddlers who have epilepsy is to put them into the equivalent of a fasting state for a couple, 3 years, which resolves in most cases, it reduces or resolves the epilepsy. Now, we have some very good data following up these children who would be throughout life, and they spend their whole life overcoming the damage that is done during the 2 to 3 years that they spend on the ketogenic diet, okay? So why would a parent put a 2-year-old on this diet? Because if you have a child who's taking medication and still having 50 seizures a day, this child isn't going to have a life, all right? So my work is all about evaluate the risks and benefits and then decide what is the best thing to do. And given the options, this is a better option than the alternative, a medicated person who can't leave home ever, not have a life. But having said that, you spend the rest of your life recovering from it, right? Now, to be put in a state of ketosis, you have to measure your ketones, you have to weigh and measure everything that you eat. When these children, and I'll get to what this has to do with your question, but when these children, for example, eat a cracker, they seizure out. So you know right away that they've gone out of ketosis. So we have all these people living in the normal world here who say they're on a ketogenic diet. They're not measuring, weighing anything. They're just eating a lot of fat, all right? So first of all, they're not generating the state that Taubes is suggesting people need to be in order to benefit from this. They're just eating fat. And we've had cancer patients who've joined Wellness Forum who, when our dietitians took a look at their food journals, they weren't in a state of ketosis, so they never got any benefit from eating this high-fat diet. They were just eating a lot of fat. So Taubes misleads people, and his buddies mislead people into thinking you just start eating a high-fat diet and then you're there. The second thing that I want to say about this is that this whole notion that insulin secretion in response to eating beans and potatoes and fruit is somehow bad for you, and grains and that sort of thing is ridiculous. This is normal. This is the way humans operate, all right? You eat carbohydrate, some of it becomes glucose. It has to get into the cells. That's the energy currency of the cell. You're going to need insulin to make that happen. We don't want to stop that process. The problem that people have is not that they're eating a high carbohydrate diet. It's that they're eating a high fat, high protein, junk food carbohydrate diet. In other words, again, if you were to bring our dietitians in here to talk about this, and they're looking at food journals all day long, all right, what they would tell you is they see animal food 2 to 3 times a day, white bread to make the sandwich, white flour pasta, toaster pastries, this is what is going on in the American diet. And I laugh when I hear these people say, yeah, the people who are coming to see me are all eating a whole foods plant-based diet, and they're fat and they have high insulin levels and they're diabetic. Those are not the diabetic overweight people. So this is just ludicrous. And I want to say something else. Gary Taubes is a reporter, used to be, I don't know if he still is, with the New York Times. He developed an interest in health because I think he started covering health as part of his, what he was doing for the Times. But he has no clue what he's talking about. And by the way, I don't play the expert or credentials game because we have some Harvard and Cornell educated doctors who mislead the public every day. So this isn't a matter of the credentials make the person credible. It's a matter of the person's understanding of physiology and health. And he doesn't understand that. All right. He routinely makes patently false statements. I mean, we could take the entire 90 minutes we have here and take apart that paragraph or several paragraphs that he wrote And I can show you where he's patently false. And he's probably because he's never taken anatomy, he's never taken physiology, he's never taken biochemistry and chemistry, and he's never really studied how people become diabetic, because this whole idea that you're predisposed to become diabetic and eating carbohydrate turns it on. Well, the Chinese have been eating a high carbohydrate diet for thousands of years. They only recently started becoming diabetic. Why? Because of the Western diet, not because of the carbohydrate. So even from an epidemiological observational standpoint, what he's saying is patently false, and you can just go country by country and prove it.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? When I started reporting on this subject as a journalist 20 years ago, virtually no meaningful research had been published to test the claims of the diet book doctors, most famously Robert Atkins, who advocated this way of eating. Since then, carbohydrate-restricted diets, keto or otherwise, may have become the most tested diets in history. The website clinicaltrials.gov reports more than 100 clinical trials of ketogenic diets in progress and nearly 90% completed. The findings are consistent. Ketogenic eating is safe and effective at controlling both weight and blood sugar. Pick a disease from Alzheimer's and anxiety disorders to traumatic brain injury and tumors, and researchers somewhere are probably testing whether eating a ketogenic diet improves its prognosis. In 2019, the American Diabetes Association concluded that low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate diets, that is, keto, were the only dietary therapies that consistently resulted in beneficial outcomes for adults with diabetes or prediabetes. In 2017, more than 100 Canadian physicians co-signed a letter to the Huffington Post declaring that they personally follow keto-like regimens and now counsel their patients to do so too. What we see in our clinics, these physicians wrote, is that blood sugar values go down, blood pressure drops, chronic pain decreases or disappears, lipid profiles improve, inflammatory markers improve, energy increases, weight decreases, sleep is improved, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome symptoms are lessened, etc. Medication is adjusted downward or even eliminated, which reduces the side effects for patients and the costs to society. The results we achieve with our patients are impressive and durable. Again, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
Oh, so much to talk about. The first thing I love is when doctors write letters to medical journals or conduct diet trials. Doctors get zero nutrition training in school. So there is not a more unqualified group of people to comment on this than doctors, okay? They're notoriously unhealthy themselves. They don't eat a healthy diet. So that's the first thing. But here's the thing. First of all, the American Diabetes Association, if you go to their website right now, they actually, he's completely misrepresenting what's there. And the reason I know this is I just checked it. It just so happens to make sure that it was the same as the last time I looked at it, which is that they basically say almost any kind of diet can be configured to control diabetes, all right? And just so you know, the American Diabetes Association's biggest funders are Big Pharma. And there's no question that they're not interested in curing type 2 diabetes or putting it into remission, maybe a better term to use. They're interested in making sure that their Big Pharma partners, and all the disease groups, by the way, are sponsored by Big Pharma. So their interest is in making sure that drugs get promoted to type 2 diabetics. So essentially what they say is you can eat a Mediterranean diet, you can eat a keto diet, you can eat a paleo diet, you can eat a vegetarian diet. The bottom line is that any diet that you want to eat, you can go on to the ADA's website and you will find permission to eat it on that site. And the idea of, anything you want to do is fine. Well, it pleases your donors. It certainly makes your drug company sponsors happy because you're going to keep everybody sick. But certainly is not the experience of what goes on in real life. All right. So I tell people all the time, stay away from the disease sites for the most part. They say some good things, but the vast majority of what you see on these disease group websites is pharma sponsored. And by the way, the people who work in these organizations, I think that they mean well. They don't have any idea. So that brings me to the medical literature. All right. Marcia Angel, who was at one point in time the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, made a comment that after she retired from that position, and she's written several books and articles on this topic, or at least one book and several articles on this topic, that most of what's in medical journals is complete rubbish. All right, it is. It's just complete garbage. The key is learning how to sort out about the 5% of it in recent years that is worth paying attention to versus the 95% that is absolute garbage. Now, when it comes to looking at diet, most of what you see published in medical journals is what happens in 12 weeks on a diet, okay? Very seldom is the follow-up for months or years or decades or something of that nature. And there are a lot of things that you can do in the short term to change a health marker, all right, that do not do well in the long term. So let's take a real obvious example. Everybody watching this has experienced chemotherapy for tumors. What happens is often, the chemotherapy shrinks the tumor and everybody's high-fiving it and opening champagne. This is going great, only to have the tumor come back and the person dies 6 months later anyway. So short-term manipulation of surrogate markers is not an indication of long-term health outcomes, all right? I testified about this in front of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in 2019. And I watched doctors get up there and talk about keto diets for weight loss and diabetes. Of course, industry groups did, and reporters, and who testifies in front of these committees? It's just a free-for-all when it comes right down to it. But when I got up there, I was one of the last people, and I planned to say something else. But what I said was, listen, if we are only going to worry about short-term markers and weight loss, okay, glucose control and weight loss, I'm going to suggest some other things that work great if we don't care about the long term. First thing I threw out was cocaine addiction, all right? All the cocaine addicts I've ever seen, they are skinny people with low cholesterol levels. Well, if we don't care about the long term, this might actually work. Now, the problem of getting the cocaine, it's illegal and all that kind of stuff, but it does work. I'll tell you another thing that works great for weight loss and low blood glucose levels: chemotherapy. Okay, cancer patients are notoriously wasting away and their glucose levels are low. They're nauseous, they're vomiting. All right, now I'm only somewhat being facetious here because really, if we don't care about the long term, almost anything goes. And that's what these people are basically saying. So if you look at a diet plan, okay, and all of these trials, and one of the reasons it's practical that you don't see the follow-up for months and years at a time is it's expensive to do and cumbersome to do. All right, so you take people like Caldwell Esselstyn and Dean Ornish. They have done follow-up studies. Esselstyn probably the longest, okay, over a 30-year period of time, to show that they not only get better in the short term, they get better in the long term. They live longer. And that's what people are looking for. I've never talked to anybody about their health who said, listen, I just want to have the best blood work 30, 90 days from now so I can show everybody how great my blood work is. They want to live longer and they want to live better. And these people do not deliver that. They're all talking about short-term results. And by the way, they're not the only ones. This is the way medicine is structured. It's all about short-term. We're treating lab tests. We are not treating humans. And we're not doing for humans what humans really want, which is a longer life and one in which their life and health is better. And this nonsense that they're talking about doesn't take them there. The last thing I'm going to say is Adkins died of heart disease, okay? That's conveniently forgotten because he fell down. But when he fell down, which is what landed him in the hospital, that might have been what finished him off. But he was obese and he had advanced heart disease. And so holding Adkins up as the unsung hero of all of this is beyond insane at this point in time. So all of this, unfortunately, we live in a somewhat free country. I say somewhat because things have changed a lot, where you can say almost anything you want, and I support that. But the problem is that this idea that doctors endorse it gives it credence that it doesn't deserve.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? No meaningful experimental evidence, no clinical trials exist to support the contention that we would live longer, healthier lives by eating mostly plants rather than animal-sourced foods.
Well, Mr. Taubes must not know much about the blue zones because they eat plant-based diets. He must not know much about Ornish, Barnard, Esselstyn. I mean, these are, look at Roy Swank and his work with MS patients. You know, animal fat, saturated fat, and dairy were the enemies of progress for multiple sclerosis patients. So that is, it's either that he is willfully ignorant, like he doesn't take any time to look into it. Or he's ignoring this huge body of evidence because it doesn't fit into his narrative. But the blue zones, the blue zones all they eat varied diets in terms of the individual foods that they eat. And they're liberal in different respects. Like some people in Sardinia, they drink alcohol more, all right? But the Okinawans eat sweet potatoes more than other groups. But if you look at the macronutrient content of your diet, they're all high carbohydrate diets. They're all plant-centered. Animal food is a condiment, mostly for economic reasons more than anything else, but it doesn't change the fact that the healthiest people on the planet do not eat a diet like he's contemplating at all.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? The big difference between the physicians and researchers who admitted to using keto 20 years ago for temporary weight loss and those eating and prescribing keto today is that the latter now believe these diets are the healthiest way for them and their patients to eat. They don't worry about the saturated fat their patients will be eating because the clinical trials confirm this way of eating is beneficial, and they can see their patients and themselves getting healthier, often over the course of weeks or a few months. They are loath to recommend anything else. I have interviewed more than 120 of these physicians who tell me that they chose medicine as a career because they wanted to make their patients healthy, not to manage chronic disease. Getting their patients off carb-rich foods, at the very least, sugars, grains, and starches, and eating something akin to keto makes that happen. When public health authorities argue that a healthy diet for all means mostly plants, they make the job of these physicians and the challenge to their patients that much harder.
I don't even know where to start with that. I mean, the bottom line is that, again, physicians know nothing about diet. Physicians know a lot about how to change markers in the short term. What they're doing is they're using a keto diet to change markers in the short term instead of the drugs that they were prescribing before to change markers in the short term. All right. So if you make, here's what I've told people for years, because I get into this discussion all the time with alternative medicine practitioners who prescribe supplements, and they're doing the same thing. All right. So let's call this the paradigm. The paradigm is short-term strategies to change markers for health, which is distinctly different than long-term strategies to change health and lifespan. All right. So what these doctors are essentially doing is right within their comfort zone. Right now, if I'm a medical doctor in practice, which I'm not, but if I were, I would have been trained to give people with high cholesterol a statin drug, people with high blood pressure an ACE inhibitor, people with high glucose levels get metformin. All right. So now what I'm doing is I'm basically saying I'm going to use a keto diet. I didn't understand in the past that those things I was doing were harmful. I've gained no more understanding of short-term, long-term, short-term benefit, long-term harm. I'm still inside that paradigm. So now I've just chosen a different way of harming people because I haven't left the paradigm, because I haven't decided that we have to look beyond the short term, few weeks, few months. The long term is where the action is. And there, again, I'll go back to, there are a lot of things that you can do short term to change things. All right. So if these doctors actually maintain a long-term relationship with their patients, what they will see, and most doctors don't anymore, that's part of the problem, by the way, because changing insurance plans, you have to change doctors, people move around a lot more than they did before, et cetera. But if they actually maintain contact with these patients over a long period of time, the patients who have nice low glucose levels today and they've lost weight are going to be tomorrow's cancer patients. They're going to be tomorrow's heart attack patients. You're still laying down plaque in the arteries, even if you're losing weight and your insulin levels or your glucose levels are lower. So it's the same paradigm. And until we start training doctors to pay attention to outcomes. All right, so here, I'll give you an analogy that I think makes the point. Let's say I get in my car to go home from the office this afternoon. and the oil light comes on. All right, so I take it to the gas station tomorrow or the repair shop, and they say, well, this is easy to fix. I'm just going to disconnect the fuse that lights up the oil lamp. That'll be $20 and you can keep driving. Okay, well, that's a short-term fix, isn't it? I don't even have to, I don't have to pay attention to it. There's no light on, nothing's warning me, right? So aren't we just good to go? No, we're not, because sooner or later, whatever caused that oil light to come on is going to cause more problems down the road. We never got to the actual cause of the problem. All right. We train mechanics to solve the cause, to resolve the cause. We do not train doctors to do that in medical school. And until we change that paradigm, they're going to keep hurting people. They're just hurting them in different ways.
A recent study claimed vegans have more bone fractures. Is this true?
No. But you can find a recent study to show anything. If you wanted to, I will promise you, if you spent 20 minutes just looking online, you could find a study that shows that eating chocolate at 2 o'clock in the afternoon changes your metabolism so that you lose weight easier and you can eat anything you want at night. So, and the other thing too is a study shows nothing, all right? You have to look at the preponderance of evidence. And it goes beyond. The lazy person's approach to health is citing a study that shows something. It's the laziest form of medical journalism that you can possibly exhibit, because you're basically saying, I'm too lazy to look into the bigger picture, so I'm just going to report something that suits the story I want to tell. So if I'm against vegan diets, I'll find something to support it. If I'm for vegan diets, I'll find a study to support it. It goes both ways, by the way. You find just as much laziness on all sides of the issue, but you have to go with the preponderance of the evidence, and that's absolutely nonsense.
Do you recommend bariatric surgery? Let's try that one more time. Do you recommend bariatric surgery for some patients?
No. And I'll tell you why. The most ridiculous part of bariatric surgery is that in order to qualify for it, you have to demonstrate that for a period of weeks, you're capable of changing your eating pattern and adhering to it and losing weight. Well, once you do that, what responsible surgeon would do bariatric surgery? Just keep doing that. You demonstrated to yourself that you can adhere to a healthier diet and lose weight, so we're going to keep doing it. The problem, this again goes to an earlier comment that I made about addressing the cause. How do people become obese? They become obese because they either don't understand how to eat. I used to be fat, okay? And the reason was I didn't understand, really, I never thought about it. Nobody told me. If you eat a Cobb salad that has chicken and avocado and bacon and cheese and ranch dressing on it, you might as well have had a cheese pizza for lunch, right? I thought, oh, it's salad. Well, it was salad with 45 grams of fat or 50 grams of fat. So I didn't know how to eat, right? Once I learned how to eat, I lost a bunch of weight and I'm not fat anymore. Well, the other reason that people become fat, overweight, obese, is because they have eating issues based on emotions or not being able to handle something in life. Well, isn't it good to get to the root of that so that you don't just take up some other form of making your troubles go away? And we have very, very good evidence showing that when people engage in self-destructive behavior patterns, whether it's drinking or smoking or gambling or drugs or eating or whatever, and they'll just replace it with something else if you don't get to the bottom of what the problem is. So I think it's a tremendous disservice to perform bariatric surgery. One last thing that I'll add, we have some very good studies now showing that one of the major reasons to justify bariatric surgery is the fact that hospitalization costs go down, and they do in the short term, but in the long term, they're just as high, which tells us there's a high rate of complications. A lot of these people eat themselves right back into obesity after the honeymoon period, because whatever type of bariatric surgery you have, you can eventually stretch out whatever the stomach is comprised of to normal size, and you can go right back to where you were before. So I don't think it's such a good idea.
Are medical journals a good source of accurate health, nutrition, and medical information?
Medical journals are sometimes the worst source if you don't vet the material. And I want to talk about vetting medical journal articles, all right? So the problem we have, I've mentioned this before, the problem we have with medical journal articles is you can find one to support anything. You can find a few of them in some cases. I mean, I could do a 45-minute presentation on the benefits of smoking cigarettes using journal articles. Well, people respect some of the journals in which these articles are printed, all right, published. So the key is, how do you sort it out? And what I've said for a long time, I compare reading medical journals to playing football, all right? So there are rules for football, right? You can't just run up and down the field for an hour and then sit around and talk about who won. There are rules about who can play. I'm 64 years old. I weigh 119 pounds. I'd make a terrible linebacker. They're not going to let me play. And then the games are always an hour, 4 15-minute quarters, and a first down is always 10 yards. And to make a field goal, you have to kick it between the poles, right? Okay, so there are rules for football. And when football is played according to rules, what happens is at the end of a season where thousands of football games are played, you've got maybe 8 or 10 plays that people really talk about that are disputed. Well, I think this happened, I think that happened, but it pretty well organizes the game so people can watch and you know who won, right? Okay, let's contrast that with the way medical journal articles are read and reported. He said, she said, I read an article, you read a different one. Well, I read this doctor's book and he referenced all this stuff. I read a different doctor's book. He came up with a different conclusion entirely. And then you get into the, my cousin told me and my uncle's best friend's neighbor's wife's coworker said, all right? So all this confusion, and there's no end to it, and there's no conclusion that can be drawn from it. So what I have said for years, what we do here at Wellness Forum Health is we have rules for looking at medical journal articles. And it begins with, what are the conflicts of interest? And they're not always disclosed in the articles. So I tell people, do a search on these authors and you will find things that are not disclosed in the article, all right? The second thing is the study design appropriate? And we were talking about the short-term studies on diet when it's the long-term that we should be looking at. So a 90-day study on diet tells you nothing, all right? The third thing you look at, correlation versus a cause and effect relationship. Things can be statistically significant, but not meaningfully different in terms of client outcomes. So a drug can reduce your risk of something by 0.25%, but it doesn't change anything for the patient in any meaningful way. So I won't go through all of them, but my point here is that medical journals are full of garbage. Now, you don't want to throw the baby out with bathwater. You want to extract from medical journals the stuff that's good. So how do you do that? Well, you apply rules to that, just like you apply rules to playing football. And all of a sudden, you can start to make sense out of a lot of contradictory information and arrive at something close to the truth.
What do you eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner on most days?
Well, I have usually 5 or 6 meals. I eat a lot of food because I'm really active. But my typical breakfast, I like to have the same thing for breakfast, and then there's a lot of variation later on I'll tell you about. But for breakfast, I have our smoothie. We make a smoothie mix here that is just vegetable powders. So it's plant milk, vegetable powders, brewer's yeast, flax seeds, food grade green tea, a banana, and frozen fruit. And then I have 2 pieces of toast with fat-free hummus. That's breakfast. It's a lot of calories, but I exercise in the morning and burn up 500-600 calories, and so it carries me through. Lunchtime, great big salad, and then some kind of starch vegetable thing. So today, I already know what I'm going to have because I batch cook on Sunday, so I'll have my great big salad, which I toss together, and then I'm going to have this Brussels sprouts, chickpea, rice dish that I made, and I'll have a big bowl of that I'll warm up in the microwave. And then in the middle of the afternoon, I always get hungry, so I'll have something like a black bean and rice wrap, or some soup that I'll warm up in the microwave, something like that. Then dinner, another great big salad. And then I don't know what I'm going to have tonight, but probably I bake a lot of sweet potatoes, for example, pasta and asparagus, that sort of thing. And then I always get hungry late at night because I work till 11 or sometimes later, and I'll have a bowl of cereal or a bowl of fruit. I have probably some pineapple and blueberries. That's what I've got in my fridge right now, which is a great late night, I like sweet things late at night. So that's what a typical day looks like for me.
Can cancer be prevented? If so, what % of the time and how?
Most cancer is preventable. There are exceptions to the rule, and I personally lost a work associate many years ago. He was 29 years old, died of cervical cancer. She was genetically predisposed. Her father died at a young age, also of cancer. There were some mitigating factors. Some thought that she might have been able to prevent it, but that type of thing happens, all right? Most cancers can be prevented if people will eat well and keep themselves lean. And eat well, meaning plant-based, doesn't have to be vegan. I'm crystal clear about that. Vegan is a choice. I've made it. I like it, but you don't have to eat a vegan diet to achieve optimal health. But you do have to eat a carbohydrate. Back to our point talking about Gary Taubes, you have to eat a high carbohydrate, whole foods, plant-based diet. I think that's a big distinguishing characteristic. And you notice when I went through my typical day of food eating, you didn't hear a lot about toaster pastries and that sort of thing. You heard a lot about salad and sweet potatoes and, soups and rice and vegetables and that kind of thing. So most cancers are preventable.
Is there a way to stop cancer from spreading if you have it and prevent it from coming back for people in remission?
Yes. There are a lot of, but I think it's a complicated thing. All right. And the reason I say this is that there are some contributing factors to cancer in addition to diet and lifestyle habits, how your leanness, your exercise, that sort of thing. One book that I recommend that cancer patients read is Radical Remission, which is a study that was done. Kelly Turner wrote that book, and she did a study of 1,000 cancer patients who had horrible prognoses, short lifespans expected. And she asked them the strategies that they used to survive. These are long-term survivors of what people would call terminal cancer. And there were 9 strategies they had in common. And the first chapter in her book is about diet. They all adopted some form of a plant-based diet. They often didn't become vegan, but they adopted a plant-based diet. But they did a lot of other things too. They were routinely described by their doctors as being annoying because these are people who take control of their health. They look at doctors as advisors, all right? They used a combination of conventional and alternative treatment most of the time. They followed their intuition. They used supplements. They looked at other reasons for having developed such severe cancer. Such as their relationships with people, stress that they've been under, that sort of thing. And then they addressed everything. And I could go on, but I think that stopping cancer from progressing or getting rid of it and keeping it from coming back often involves an examination of one's life in its entirety. And what I learned from her book, by the way, I didn't have cancer when I read it, I learned some things about rearranging my life a little bit differently because I can be pretty driven and that sort of thing, which is good in some ways, but not so much in others. One last thing I'll say about this is that I think that there is a growing movement in the cancer, not in the cancer industry, but in people who look at cancer from the outside, to suggest that in some cases, you don't want to get rid of the cancer. You want to turn it into a chronic condition. And there are a lot of even mainstream people talking about this now, that a lot of cancer treatment gets rid of the cancer and kills the patient at the same time. Whereas turning cancer into a chronic condition, particularly if you have advanced cancer that could be managed over a long period of time, like a type 1 diabetic, you don't get rid of type 1 diabetes. You manage it and keep your insulin levels low by the way that you live your life. So yeah, cancer is not a death sentence. It doesn't have to be. And I think it just scares people so much. It scares them into submitting to things that they would be better off not submitting to.
Do you recommend people get colonoscopies? Do they save lives? Should we avoid heating oils?
Okay, so let's talk about colonoscopy first. What I recommend that people do is look at the evidence. Okay, now what they find when they look at the evidence is that there is not a single randomized controlled trial that has ever shown that colonoscopy reduces your risk of dying of colon cancer, all right, as a screening tool. All right, there's a difference between using something to screen the general population versus using something to diagnose a person who has symptoms. There's some good reasons for colonoscopy in those cases. So as a screening tool, not so much. And the Canadians took it off of the schedule of recommended screenings and recommended other alternatives instead in 2016 for that reason. Other countries are often much more likely to take an objective look at this type of thing. And one of the reasons is, by the way, that in the United States, we'll spend an unlimited amount of money on healthcare. In other countries, particularly those that have centralized or socialized medicine, they don't have an unlimited budget. They're constantly having to cut costs. And sometimes it's draconian, like you can't see a doctor, and sometimes it's actually making sense, like we found that this doesn't have any value. So the Canadians took colonoscopy off the list. There are some other tests that work just as well without all of the downside, because what the studies do show is that it's a draw. For every person that you might save their life, you're going to have somebody have serious injury or death as a result of the procedure itself. So I think it should be a carefully considered decision, and the idea that you reach a certain age and start having colonoscopies is not really grounded in science. Now, you asked me about heating oils, cooking oils. Yeah, you know, I've always recommended that people get the oil out of their diet, mainly because it's so calorie dense. And one of the reasons why diets fail, and they all do in the long term, they all work in the short term. No matter what you do, it works in the short term, okay? If you and I were to decide we're going to go on a diet where we're just going to eat breakfast and nothing else every day, we'd do it for a few weeks until we couldn't stand it anymore. So the data at 12 weeks, we're toughing it out and doing it, but where are we a year later, right? So one of the problems with diets is, the many problems, is that people are told to try to control their intake of high fat, calorie dense stuff, all right? So a tablespoon of oil has 14 grams of fat and 130 calories. That's a lot, all right? So trying to control intake of that is hard. The same thing is true of other high-fat foods. A cup of avocado has 21 grams of fat. So just think about starting my day with avocado toast and 21 grams of fat, and then we go to a nice big salad at lunchtime with 3 tablespoons of an oil-based salad dressing, and my gosh, it's not even 1 o'clock yet, and I've already had 70 grams of fat, you know? And then people say, I can't understand why the weight isn't coming off. I'm eating all plants, right? Well, you're eating too many calories. So I've always told people, arrange your life so that you don't have to do all this. In other words, my salad dressing has 7 calories per tablespoon. If I drank the whole bottle, I can't hurt myself. Now, isn't that an easier way to live than drizzling and trying to control and keep track of how much I had and all this kind of thing? It's you know, people cannot lose weight and maintain a healthy weight and a healthy life while they're trying to weigh and measure everything and control intake. They do much better when they can, I call it eating with careless abandon, because you just don't have to worry about it.
What can you do to prevent dementia, Alzheimer's, and memory loss?
To prevent Alzheimer's and dementia and memory loss, we tend to group it all together into Alzheimer's, but let's just call it loss of memory and cognition. I think it's a multifaceted thing. I think the first thing is that you see Alzheimer's predominantly in westernized countries with animal foods-based diet, so eat more of a plant-based diet. The second thing is you have to use your brain. Okay, and we see older people deteriorating because they don't have anything to do, they don't have anything to think about. So you have to be engaged. And we have some great studies showing that, for example, the more languages you speak, the less likely you are to develop Alzheimer's. One thing that I've recommended for years is in every state, the public colleges and universities allow people over 65 years of age to attend. You can't get a degree, but you can attend almost any class you want to for free. So if I were retiring next year, which I'm not, I could go to Ohio State here and take classes in comparative religions, and I could take art classes and all kinds of things, whatever I'm interested in, which would keep my brain going, right? So you've got to use it or lose it. It's not just the muscles in the body, it's your brain as well. Staying hydrated, your body uses a lot of the water. Oxygenation, you know, and this goes to what's good for the heart is good for the brain because the blood vessels carry all the materials needed for brain function to the brain. So it's really important to have your cardiovascular system in good shape. So the diet people eat to make cardiovascular disease go away or to prevent it is good for the brain. Exercise. Exercise has this magical result, which is called production of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So when you're exercising, your brain makes this stuff and it improves brain function, expands brain capacity. It's why I'm so smart, because I exercise every day. But, so yeah, that's how you keep yourself from ending up with Alzheimer's. And at the earliest stages, by the way, we've worked with a lot of people here over the years who would come in or call us with a family member who seems to be having difficulty remembering things, slipping. And we get them into social engagement, join a church, for example. That's an easy thing to do. It doesn't cost money. Start working out, exercise of some sort. It can be just going for a walk every day for a half hour on a treadmill in the wintertime if you live in an inclement climate like I do here. Start drinking enough water, eating a good diet, a hobby, learn how to paint, learn to speak French, start playing the guitar. You got to use it or lose it, right? And seeing people come back from that brink to good function.
How do you prevent diabetes?
Same way you prevent Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease and cancer. It's all related. It's all related. Colin Campbell, in his book Whole, Rethinking the Science of Nutrition, made a comment. This book came out a long time ago, and I still use this all the time. The importance of the breadth of an effect of an intervention. Okay, so in medicine, we see, and in health, we see so much, he refers to it as reductionism. And so people are going to various doctors. They go to an endocrinologist and a cardiologist and a gastroenterologist and a psychiatrist and a gynecologist. Everybody specializes in a body part, and everybody's working on an individual body part or marker, all right? So that's a very inefficient way to look at your health. And so you back up a little bit and say, okay, what goes wrong with the human body? And what is the thing that could target all of that? And that's health promoting diet. And the breadth of the effect is something that we should be evaluating. I was talking before about evaluating long-term, and I think that's real important. Dr. Campbell says, let's take into consideration the breadth of the effect that you're having, that it isn't just weight. You affect diabetes, prevent it or put it into remission, autoimmune disease, high cholesterol, markers for cardiovascular disease, and so on. So same thing, no matter what disease you ask me about, almost any disease you ask me about, it's going to be related to diet, exercise, hydration, that sort of thing.
You have a chapter in your book called The Dietary Establishment. What does that mean to you?
The dietary establishment it's a multifaceted thing. But let's just start at the government level. You've got the United States Department of Agriculture, which started as an advocacy organization for farmers. And by the way, I think it's good to have an advocacy organization for farmers because I don't know about you, but I'm pretty attached to eating. Farmers provide us with food. And I think a little known fact, because we're also critical of the USDA, it was formed under Abraham Lincoln's administration. And one of the biggest reasons for forming the USDA was that what farmers were doing, because they didn't know better, is that they would overuse the land and move west. Okay, so you didn't have to be real smart to figure out that sooner or later you end up at the Pacific Ocean and then we're out of food, right? So the USDA actually did some really good things in terms of teaching farmers, developing strategies to preserve land and that sort of thing. So there was a good reason for this organization to exist, or this agency to exist. What happened, though, is someplace along the line, they decided that they were going to also issue dietary guidelines for Americans. And this conflict of interest, which is institutional and unresolvable, has created a lot of our problems. You've got a group that helps farmers that is also telling people what to eat. And if they were to actually tell people the right thing about what to eat, it would be against the interest of the farmers that they're trying to help. So we need to separate that out. So that's part of the dietary establishment. Then you've got the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which trains dietitians. And it's an archaic form of training. It goes back to it really came out of the home ec departments, which was more about how to prepare food than it was health promoting diets. And so, I've seen this huge, in the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, this huge gap. You've got the biggest majority of them that are still promoting these inaccurate dietary guidelines for Americans, okay? They are still beholden to big food, which is part of their sponsorship. And then you have a minority of these dietitians, like the ones we work with here, who have decided, much like good doctors have decided, the medical establishment does not recommend what I know to be right, who are practicing entirely differently. I'm hoping that group becomes bigger and bigger and kind of overwhelms the other groups. So you've got the Dietitians of America, you've got the USDA, then you've got the food manufacturers that are part of this. And they have a vested interest in influencing the academy and all the disease groups and the medical profession and the Dietary Guidelines Committee. A lot of food processors testify in front of the Dietary Guidelines Committee. And so it's just this giant source of misinformation. The publishing industry, to a certain extent, contributes to it because almost anybody can write a book and publish it. And I think that should be the way it is in the United States. But it's just a huge cabal of misinformation. And so you have a majority of people promoting wrong ideas about diet and health, and a minority of people who are saying, wait a minute, no, back up here, and let's go back to taking a look at the long term and what really leads to long-term health.
What do you think about the advice we get from disease groups, and what is a disease group?
Well, disease groups, as I affectionately refer to them, are supposed to be organizations, nonprofit organizations that exist to help people who have a particular disease. So you have the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association. Every disease has a group now. The problem is that the biggest sponsors of these organizations are big food and big pharma. And so they turn into organizations to promote big food and big pharma. They're populated with doctors and dietitians and nurses who come from the establishment, which we were just talking about. And so they don't really further the interests of diabetics, for example. What would further the interest of type 2 diabetics is showing people how to not become diabetic and showing people who have type 2 diabetes how to put it in remission. Well, drug companies aren't much interested in that, are they? And companies that sell food that lead to diabetes, they're not much interested in that. And so they're rife with conflicts of interest. And stories have been written about this in mainstream publications until everything started being censored. But mainstream publications have been saying this for a long, long time, that huge amounts of money from big pharma and big food pour into these organizations, and then they essentially promote what those people want. So the organizations need to be redone if they're going to continue to exist, in my opinion, so that they can actually be independent. And one of the things that they could do is offer fee for service type thing. I've testified about this in front of committees. What a unique way to do things. Keep yourself out of the conflicts of interest by offering services people will pay for. It's what we've done here. We don't take any sponsorship money here. We just ask people to pay for services. I'm not beholden to anybody. That works in the nonprofit sector too.
What do you recommend for someone with eczema?
Eczema has features of autoimmune, and it's often a precursor condition to autoimmune disease. So for autoimmune patients, we recommend, first of all, changing to a whole foods plant-based diet, getting rid of dairy products because of molecular mimicry, and all kinds of other reasons too. Not much justification for consuming dairy. Limiting high gluten foods because of molecular mimicry. Taking a probiotic, which restores the gut microbiome, and that is the thermostat for the immune system. So autoimmune is the misbehavior of the immune system, can't recognize self from non-self. Um, Carefully looking into data on vaccines as a cause of autoimmunity. Some of the highest payouts from the vaccine court have been for autoimmune responses to vaccines. Looking at hydration, I mean, the typical things we talk about here, weight, people who carry excess weight, your fat cells produce inflammatory molecules like cytokines. And so the body exists in a constant state of inflammation, which is bad for everything. For most autoimmune diseases develop in women, so hormonal imbalances are usually a contributing factor, taking a look at that. So it's a multifaceted approach, but eczema is not a life-threatening condition. It can just lead to conditions that are life-threatening if you don't nip it in the bud.
Is there any data on the impact on disease of doing a 100% water fast?
Yes, actually. Dr. Alan Goldhammer is the founder of True North in Santa Rosa, California. I've sent hundreds of people out there, all with good results. And water-only fasting, when done in a very confined, organized way where you're completely at rest, okay, and under the care of physicians. I'm a strong advocate for that. Do not try at home alone. Has been shown to have all kinds of positive effects. One of the things that Dr. Goldhammer has been doing recently is publishing articles on the effects of water fasting, and he's even with some cancer patients doing some long-term follow-up. So he's documented in case reports a couple of cases of remission of cancer due to water fasting. So the way I describe it to people in terms of its effect is it's like rebooting your computer. Sometimes your computer just gets to the place where you got to reboot it. It just won't function, right? You reboot it and then it's fine. All the updates happen. And so when you stop digesting food and you just rest in a state of rest, a lot of things happen. And by the way, fasting has been used even in biblical times for both spiritual enlightenment and for health renewal. And one thing I tell people is that things that last for thousands of years generally have some merit. You notice bloodletting didn't last very long. We figured out pretty soon that didn't work. The Halsted mastectomy, that only went on for a few decades. We figured out that doesn't work. But when you see a practice that has gone on for thousands of years, that's usually a pretty good sign that there's some merit to it.
Should we add fats to our diet from avocados, olives, raw seeds, raw nuts, hemp oil, flax oil, olive oil?
Well, added fats, I don't want anybody to add fat to the diet. In other words, do you need some fat? Yes. And if you're eating a plant-based diet, you're going to take in some fat. People don't recognize chickpeas contain fat. Soy contains some fat, so you're not going to eat a fat-free diet no matter what you eat, and nobody is proposing that. Oils I talked about earlier, it's just such concentrated fat and calories, and with 2/3 of the country overweight or obese, I just can't fathom why people think that it's okay to eat oil. When it comes to nuts and avocados and that sort of thing, people overeat that stuff. And so what we've told people here for years is how about eating that when it is part of a recipe or something that you order in a restaurant. So there's a restaurant here in Columbus that a lot of us like, and they serve this, it's a dinner plate of kale salad. It's fabulous. And it has slices of avocado on top. I eat that. There's a restaurant near my lake house. They have these wraps that black beans and avocado. I eat that. What I don't do is go to the store and buy 4 avocados and bring them home and say, okay, what am I going to put this in, right? Because that leads to the 10, 20, 30, 40 grams of fat at a time. The same thing with nuts. I never reach my hand in the bag and grab a handful of cashews, but I'll chop them up and sprinkle them on top of a recipe, for example, or use them in cooking, and that's fine to do. So we're not suggesting that people not eat this stuff. We're suggesting that people not look for ways to eat it all the time because it usually leads to overeating it all the time.
What's wrong with eating fish? Everyone says it's healthy.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with eating fish. I think it should be wild caught if you're going to consume it. We've never taught a vegan diet here. It's tied up in that issue, okay? For the record, I'm a pretty well-known vegan. I like eating a vegan diet. I have a history of extremism. I took up running. First race I ran was a marathon. People said, did you ever think about starting with a 5K? Well, in my world, if you're going to run, you run. But I used to be a smoker. I smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. Right? So that's kind of my personality. But it would be very disingenuous of me to say that you have to be a vegan in order to regain or maintain your health, because the blue zones, which we talked about earlier, none of them are vegan. The Okinawans are not vegan. What they share is they eat a tiny amount of animal food. And depending upon where you live, that determines the type of animal food. So the Ethiopians eat goat. They don't eat goat in rural China. They don't eat it in Okinawa, right? So I don't think there's anything the matter with having 2 or 3 servings of animal food a week, if you choose to do it. Just make sure it's organic if it's a land animal, wild caught if it's fish, and avoiding dairy. Now, having said that, fish is not better than beef, all right? And chicken is not better than pork. Animal flesh is animal flesh. The key is to keep it at a minimum in the diet. And I have colleagues of mine, sometimes former colleagues actually at this point in time, who become apoplectic when I talk about that. But one of the reasons I think it's important to make this distinction, it's a little bit tangential to the fish question, is that a diet that people stick with for a few weeks and quit doesn't really help anything. A diet that people adopt and stick with for 10 years becomes meaningful in terms of outcomes. And so we're very interested here in the long term. Our people become members and they stay members for some of them 20 some years now. So we want to see that long-term adherence to something, not just a few weeks and then we never see them again.
Are all fruits healthy? Are some too sugary due to hybridization and not being native to our area, such as pineapples, mangoes, seedless grapes, bananas?
Okay, so that's a complex question you just asked. And the first thing is hybridization, which people perceive as a bad thing. And it's actually the reason why you and I have food right now. Hybridization is where you grow varieties of certain types of foods by crossing them with the same type of food. So if I wanted to make a white sweet potato that was long, that comes from hybridization. And there's some benefits to doing it. A lot of people are not aware that the reason why why 1 million Irish perished in the potato famine is because they were only growing one kind of potato in Ireland. Had they had hybridized potatoes, there wouldn't have been any starvation, right? So hybridization is a good thing, not a bad thing, all right? And people confuse it with genetically modified foods, not the same thing. There aren't any fruits that I discourage people from eating. There aren't any vegetables that I discourage people from eating. What I encourage people to do is to eat the foods that they like within the pattern of eating. So if somebody says, I like pineapple, I'm a person who does, I eat pineapple. Some people say, pineapple's too much work. You got to cut that. Okay, then don't eat any pineapple. All right. If you like blackberries, eat them. If you don't. But this whole idea that there are certain fruits you have to eat and certain ones that you stay away from. And if you're going to eat an apple, it needs to be a green apple. I don't like green apples. Okay. And to this point, I think it's an important point to make. I remember early in my career talking with a client. I said, well, how's it going? You're trying to eat better and all that. She says, well, it's fine. I said, well, you don't sound very excited about it. She goes, well, I'm eating green apples and kale. I said, well, it doesn't sound like you like those foods. I don't. Well, why are you eating them? Well, they say green apples are better for you, and they've got those charts say kale is the most densely nutritious vegetable. Listen, that's not going to last very long, okay? Again, going back to what I said, it's so important to get this long-term compliance. So eat the vegetables you like. Eat anything leafy green, all right? And people say, well, what about iceberg lettuce? I'll tell you what, it's better than cheeseburgers for lunch. And if that's our starting point, I'll take it. Get people eating what they want and stop trying to force them to conform to certain fruits, certain vegetables. You got to eat a sweet potato. If you eat a white potato, you must have a death wish. I mean, this is just all nonsense, and we got to get away from this kind of thing.
What do you recommend for someone who has gastrointestinal pain who is already plant-based?
Well, you have to get to the root of it. And plant-based doesn't solve everything. All right. I think that's another form of reductionism. No matter what's wrong with you, adopt this diet and it will fix everything. And if it doesn't fix it, you must not be compliant. It's just not, that's another form of nonsense. People become healthy when they look at all of the contributing factors to their health. All right. So if you've had 25 rounds of antibiotics for recurrent urinary tract infections, you're probably going to have gastrointestinal distress no matter what you eat. And if you don't take some probiotics, it probably isn't going to go away. All right. You can eat vegetables till the end of your days and it's not going to fix it. If you are eating a high fat, plant based diet, you're probably going to still have gallbladder issues. Okay. Even if you're not eating animals anymore. So you have to identify the cause. And I strongly resist this idea that plant-based eating by itself solves problems. I mean, I would say 30% of the people coming in here as members, and our dietitians would tell you this, they're already eating a plant-based diet, some of them vegan, and they're still coming in here. Why? Okay, because it didn't solve everything for them.
What is gluten? Who should avoid it? If you keep eating it, will you end up with celiac disease? Should we avoid wheat, oats, and barley since they have gluten? Are all other whole grains like quinoa, millet, amaranth, teff, buckwheat, and wild rice safe for a celiac patient?
Okay, so first of all, eating gluten is a protein in certain grain products, grain foods. Eating gluten doesn't cause celiac disease. Celiac disease is a genetically predisposed condition that develops in people who are genetically predisposed. And the solution to it is eating a medically gluten-free diet, which means avoiding all grains that contain gluten, and also paying attention to even condiments. So you'll see people who have celiac disease reading labels on soy sauce, for example, to make sure that that they're not even eating trace amounts of gluten, because while their symptoms are not the same, the response is similar to the person who has a severe peanut allergy, that even exposure to peanut dust could cause the anaphylactic shock. So the celiac patient has to stay away from all gluten. There are some people, autoimmune patients should stay away from high gluten foods because of molecular mimicry. The gluten proteins, the amino acids that make up gluten look like the amino acids that make up some tissues of the body. And we don't want autoimmune patients to develop other autoimmune diseases. And it's a complicated mechanism there. But there's no reason for the general population to avoid gluten. And the recommendation to do it is just ludicrous. It's issued by people who don't have a clue.
Of all the people you have advised over the last 10 years who followed your advice, what were the results? What percent got to their optimal blood sugar, blood pressure, and weight? What percent reversed major health issues? And what percent didn't get the expected results?
Well, of all the people, I've advised so many people directly and indirectly. I mean, hundreds of thousands. I've sold, a million books, right? So, and who knows how many people I've reached through lectures. I don't think anybody can quantify that, okay? It would require record keeping that a company like this can't actually engage in. What I can tell you is this. Typically, what happens is that people who adopt a health promoting diet and pay attention to the other things that they need to pay attention to, all right? Going back to the cancer patient, a cancer patient who eats perfectly and signs up for chemotherapy that kills people isn't going to turn out so well. So the totality of the approach to health, I think, is very important. I think people have meaningful improvements in their health. And the definition of meaningful improvement depends upon the situation, all right? So, there's this push when people start looking at this. Well, if I have type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure and all these things wrong with me, is it all going to go away? Well, if you're making a promise that everything's going to go away, I think that's incredibly misleading. What you can tell people is it's going to get better. So I teach by analogy. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you come into my office right now, and I'm sitting here and I have this huge gash on my arm. I mean, huge, okay? And it is bleeding and I'm picking at it. We're having a conversation and I tell you that, this thing is bleeding and it hurts. And at some point in time you say, listen, I don't want to meddle, but I'm pretty sure if you stop picking at that sore, it'll make things better. And you'd be right about that, right? First thing you do is stop picking at the sore. And it will get better from a common sense standpoint. We know that's the first step. Okay, so now I start asking you questions. You seem to know something about this. So how fast will it go away? Well, I don't know. Do you think it'll stop bleeding while you're here? I don't know. Do you think it'll leave a scar? Well, I don't know. Do you think I need stitches? Maybe I'm going to have to do that. Well, I don't know. Do you think it's going to get infected? I don't know. But here's what I know. The first step in solving this problem is you got to stop picking at it. Okay. And then we'll see about all the rest of this, because Pam, I suspect that when I came in here, that sore had been there for a real long time. That probably didn't happen 5 minutes before I walked in the door. And it looks like it's pretty deep and pretty bad. All right. So we're going to stop picking at it, and then we're just going to see what happens. So I don't think you can promise cure. I think you can promise that it will get better. And then, of course, you have all kinds of varying levels of compliance on diet and lifestyle change. And I think part of our job is just to continue to engage with people to try to help them stay on track, and to be compassionate about the way that we do it. And so this harsh, everybody becomes vegan, and if you're not doing it right, you're a bad person, you have a death to it. I like to get all of that out of the equation, and get all that judgment out of there. It's interesting. People will come in here sometimes, and I think it goes to the bad relationship that people have with doctors and health coaches and health advisors. They'll say, "You're going to be so mad at me." And I'll say, what do you think I'm going to be mad at you about? Well, we talked about my joining a gym, and I told you I was going to do it. I haven't done it. I tell, oh, thank God. They go, what do you mean? Well, now, if you slashed my tires or you hurt my cat, I would be very mad at you. But you didn't renew your gym membership. Whew, thank goodness, that's fixable. And you can see the palpable relief, because people are used to this judgmental, harsh, you must have a character defect if you're not doing it, So I think that all in all, our job is to help people start down a path of getting healthier. And it's going to take them where it takes them. And there's a great deal of variability in all of this. And one last thing I'll say about this, not to run on and on about it, but the documentaries in this field have been remarkably effective in motivating people. We don't read books in our society as much as we watch visual video, The one problem with them is that to make a 90-minute documentary, you're going to pick some perfect patients. And they start the film, and they have doctors who take them off their meds, and they're really supportive. And their families are all on board. And they have simple problems like type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or weight, and it goes away. And at 90 minutes or 96 minutes, everybody's living happily ever after and walking on the sand by the water with their spouse, right? In real life, it's a whole lot messier than that. So I think we have to be really careful about what we promise to people.
What should a man or woman do if a mammogram, MRI, or other diagnostic test finds something in their body that could be malignant? Should they biopsy it? Should they remove it? Should they treat with mainstream protocols? Should they consider alternative protocols?
Well, it depends on what it is and how it was found. The most common problem with men is PSA testing, which leads to biopsy. And the PSA test, I happen to know personally the guy who discovered PSA. His name's Richard Ablin, and he wrote a book called The Great Prostate Hoax, I think it's called, yeah. And it's about the fact that it's not a marker for cancer. So often the blood test that starts this whole thing is not a marker. So you end up finding things that you wouldn't find normally, all right? And in the case of men, almost all men will die with prostate cancer, but not of it. And the older they get, the more likely you are to find the benign type that isn't going to turn into anything. So better to perhaps think about not going down that path. When you use mammograms as a screening tool, the risk of being harmed is 3 to 10 times greater than the chance of benefit. And you end up finding a lot of not cancer. Ductal carcinoma is a risk factor for cancer. It's not cancer. Lobular carcinoma in situ is a risk factor for cancer. It's not cancer. When you start imaging, you often find what Gilbert Welch, he's a medical doctor in New England who's written a lot of great books on health. I recommend everything he's written. He calls them incidentalomas. Like you were looking for this, but you found a cyst on the kidney. What is it? You were looking for this, you found a spot on the lung. And so you have to be particularly cautious in the case of an incidentalloma, I think, before you go down the path of assuming it must be something devastating. We've lost the art of what I call active surveillance in this country. I don't like watchful waiting because that sounds like, oh, I'm just going to sit around, do nothing. But sometimes what you want to do is work on improving your health and see if this thing, whatever it is, stays stable or turns into something. But I'm very cautious. I would be very cautious about whether or not you're going to have these kinds of screening tests to begin with, because you're going to probably find more things that aren't harmful than are. And if you find an incidentalloma, you're going to be, I would advise real caution about whether or not to do something about it.
When it comes to medical treatment, in what cases do you feel the cure is worse than the disease or problem?
Cancer is the worst thing where the cure can be worse than the disease, but it's all that way. In other words, we've lost sight of the long-term goal. The long-term goal is longer life and better quality of life, more disease-free life, okay? So we're managing markers, and it's driven by the drug companies. And they, about 25 years ago, they started getting involved in these expert committees that set diagnostic guidelines. So let me give you a good example of how the cure is just irrelevant, right? So it used to be that when your fasting glucose was 140, your doctor would give you a lecture and say, you better do something about this or I'm going to put you on a drug. Lose some weight, that. And so you go home, you change your ways a little bit, and you keep that bad boy under 140. Well, in 2003, they ratcheted it down. The drug companies influenced it. Now it's 126 in 2003. We have 1.6 million more diabetics in the country, okay? And the dosage of the drugs increased to meet the new benchmark. You know what it is now? In many labs, 80 to 100, okay? And then they started inventing this mythical disease of prediabetes. Well, pretty soon everybody qualifies for treatment, but you're treating people who aren't sick. And when you start drugging and treating people who aren't sick, it's all risk and no possible benefit, all right? So medicine right now is a cure that is worse than the disease because in many cases there isn't even any disease. And I got to tell you, alternative practitioners are sometimes worse than the mainstream because again, that paradigm, they're working inside the same paradigm. The idea that you detect something earlier and earlier and earlier means that you're actually treating people who are not sick at all. And medicine is supposed to be for people who are sick. Now, I'm 64, so I sound like I'm 110 years old when I say this, but I grew up in an era where there was a family doctor, all right? We had a family doctor. He took care of my grandparents, he took care of my parents, my sister and I, and my uncle and aunt, and their 5 children. Family doctor. He knew our family. My mother didn't trot us off to the doctor all the time. What is this well child visit thing? What are you doing taking a well baby to a doctor? All right, this is nonsense. So he knew our family, and if something was wrong, he took care of it. I had to have my tonsils taken out. I had chronic infections as a kid, the whole 9 yards. But this idea of constant hanging out with doctors, testing and testing and testing and coming up with things that are increasingly clinically insignificant, calling it a disease and treating it, it's all the cure is worse than the not disease, I guess might be the better statement to make.
How does a man protect against prostate problems?
Get rid of the dairy products. I mean, there's a great deal of evidence suggesting that the consumption of dairy in terms of relationship to prostate cancer is there's a stronger relationship than smoking and lung cancer. So I would do that. I think the other thing is eat well, exercise, stay lean, and also understand that you are going to develop prostate cancer, okay? I think by the time you're in your 80s, like 80% of men have it. So the question is, if all men die with prostate cancer, but only 3% die of it, you have a 97% chance of being overdiagnosed, and you'd be real cautious, about testing.
How do you lose weight? Which is worse, sugar or fat when it comes to weight loss?
It isn't which is worse. It's a dietary pattern and exercise. You're not going to lose weight and be a lean person unless you exercise, because you can be lean, you can look lean on the outside, but still have a lot of body fat, which is not good. Okay. But you have to reduce calories. And the better way to do it is to eat calorie dilute, high fiber foods so you can eat what you want. I eat a gargantuan amount of food, and people say to me all the time, "You're pretty little. Where do you put it?" Well, I'm burning it for fuel. Okay. But isn't it more fun to eat big plates of food than it is to eat little tiny amounts of stuff? And when people say put it on a smaller plate, I'm just as hungry after eating not enough food on a small plate as on a big plate. Okay. So the idea of portion control is nobody does it well, nobody counts and measures well. So a calorie dilute diet. And then the reason you need to exercise is that a pound of fat burns 3 calories a day, a pound of muscle burns 14 calories a day. So what happens to people over time is their metabolism changes because they're sedentary. So they gain fat, lose muscle, their metabolic rate slows down. Then they eat all this high fat, calorie dense stuff. And sometimes people say, I'm eating the same thing that I always ate, now I'm gaining weight. Well, it's because your muscle to fat ratio has changed. So you have to strength train, you have to do aerobic activity, build muscle, burn fat, and eat a health promoting diet. And that's the key to staying lean. And then you don't have to think about it anymore. My weight doesn't fluctuate by a pound unless I just get so busy doing stuff. Like when the whole COVID thing started last year, I was writing a book about it and all that kind of stuff. And so I was just, burning like crazy, so I lost a few pounds then. But normally my weight stays very stable at the same. It's the same after a holiday. It's the same all the time. And I don't think about it at all. I just exercise 6 days a week, and I eat a health promoting diet that's low in fat, calorie dilute, high in fiber.
What is the World Health Organization and who funds them? Are they a good source of accurate, unbiased health information?
The World Health Organization is one of the most corrupt health organizations on the planet. The biggest funder as of last year was Bill Gates, and then other countries. The United States smartly withdrew from funding. I think that they're funding it again because we now have a different regime. You notice I didn't refer to it as administration. It's a different regime in charge now. We live in the People's Republic of America. But in any case, the guy who's head of the World Health Organization, Tedros, he goes by, is from Ethiopia. He was in charge of health in Ethiopia, and every international monitoring organization wrote devastating reports. You can't find him on the internet easily now because when the Gates wanted him in that position, they sanitized the internet of all this stuff. But I can show you where to find it. They all wrote him up for using donations, essentially, grants, to build health centers that didn't have running water, that sort of thing. I mean, he's just a terrible manager of anything. An ethnic group that he despised, 2 million of them disappeared from the census while he was in charge of health in the country, and he can never explain that. He's not even asked about it anymore. To tell you what kind of person he is, the guy who's in charge of the World Health Organization, they have a goodwill ambassadors group that serves, I don't know what they're supposed to do, but his first nominee was Robert Mugabe. Okay, I don't know if you know who he is. He's an African dictator that killed millions of people in his country and once proclaimed that only God could take him out as dictator of his country. He renewed President Xi's wife of China is on the Goodwill Ambassadors group. She's listed as an opera singer, but we have video of her. She's a general in the People's Army. And we have video of her singing for the troops while they slaughtered people in Tiananmen Square. She also is head of that program that locks up the Uyghurs and uses them for body parts. Great lady. I think those are exactly the type of people you want associated with the World Health Organization. Too bad Robert Mugabe, they wouldn't let him appoint him. Isn't that sad? Because he and President Xi's wife could have become good friends that way, I'm sure. So I could go on, but you get the idea. And in my book, by the way, I have a timeline that shows how the Chinese collaborated with the World Health Organization to have this fake pandemic declared.
What is the government agency called? Health and Human Services, and what is their function? What is their relation to the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC? Are they both good sources of accurate, scientifically based health and nutrition information?
The Centers for Disease Control, let's start with them. The Centers for Disease Control is funded by industry. They have a foundation, they're funded by industry. You know who their biggest donor is? Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation. Health and Human Services, corrupted by drug interests. These are all organizations that promote drug treatment, okay? I don't believe anything they say. And I think they've all collaborated along with FDA and many other, and the National Institutes of Health. They all collaborated here in the United States to pull off the COVID-19 hoax here in conjunction with the World Health Organization. By the way, we're the people suing all of them. We're filing lawsuits in every state claiming that there was no pandemic. We filed in Ohio and New Mexico. We're filing in 2 more states very soon, and we filed against all that alphabet soup of agencies federally as well.
Do you recommend dietary supplements, and if so, which ones?
Anybody who would answer that question, you want to not listen to them, all right, about which ones. I recommend dietary supplements when the risk-benefit ratio favors them, all right? The exceptions would be B12. If you're going to eat a vegan diet, you're going to need a B12 supplement. Very low dose, by the way. Your B12 requirements are only 2.4 micrograms a day, 2.6 if you're pregnant or lactating. Most people are taking horse-like doses of B12. And probiotics, which are not really dietary supplements, all right? The dietary supplements would be like your vitamins, minerals, that sort of thing. The key is looking at the benefits you're going to get and the risk you're going to take. In many cases, there's no documented benefit. And in many cases, the risk has never been looked at. And nobody knows. People come in here, they have 2 pages of supplements that they're taking. Nobody knows what the interactions of all those things are. I mean, one thing you can say for drugs, you can go online and you could look at drug interactions, know exactly what the interactions are. Nobody knows. So are your symptoms because of all that mess of stuff that you're taking? I ask people, by the way, why they're taking different things. They generally don't even know, and they never asked, okay? So I'm real cautious about supplements, and I tell people the ones you have to be the most careful about are the ones that work, because if they have an effect, they have a side effect. Now the question is the side effect that you're going to experience worth the benefit that you're going to get? And people say, well, I looked in the medical literature and I couldn't find anything about side effects. Well, is it that has been proven not to have side effects, or is it that they never looked at whether or not there are side effects? And I get the whole thing about you can't patent the stuff, and I get all that, all right? It doesn't change the fact, however, that you don't know. And often the supplements are prescribed in that same paradigm. Give me a symptom, I'll give you a supplement. We're not talking about the cause, okay?
Why was it important for you to come speak here at the Real Truth About Health conference?
The reason I like speaking at the Real Truth About Health conference is that Steve does not put filters on what people say. And I think it's really important for there to be an open forum. And one thing that people will say is, well, I watched the Truth About Health conference and some of you guys don't agree. The worst possible thing you could do is watch a conference where everybody agrees with everybody. What the heck is anybody going to learn from anybody then, right? You know, and so we don't expect that consensus in other areas of life so much, so we shouldn't expect it here. So I think the opportunity to hear what a lot of different people have to say, and I think generally speaking, from what I've experienced, I think I've been at all of them, I think, but there's a really good cross section of people coming at things from different points of view, and I think that's really, really important. We need more of it, not less of it.
Thank you, Pam.
That's it?
I think we're good. We've marked our hour and a half, and we want to be respectful of your time as well. So,
okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless there's anything else you want to add.
No, that's good. That's good. Thanks. I mean, I can do this all day. This is easy for me. I'm not asking you to work very hard.
Well, likewise, and it's not just blowing sunshine, but it's always a pleasure to see you and work with you. And gosh, we've been working together for a few years now already.
Long time. Yeah. Well, tell Steve I said thank you very much, and we'll maybe look forward to being in the same room next year.
Yes, fingers crossed. Absolutely. And be well, and thanks for all your work. It's impacting my life as well. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good
Thanks,
one.
and be well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.